this is one of the talks you can access.
Oh, yes, right. Yeah,
That's why these extra people are coming in.
yeah, okay, good point. Welcome to all of you who are recently joined us.
8 o'clock.
8 o'clock, let's pass the torch to Rob Faux, our presenter for tonight, who's going to talk to us about postal history. And welcome to this meeting presentation, which is hosted by the Chicago Philatelic Society tonight. Glad to have you. Stay in touch, please. Okay, take it away, Rob.
All right, it's nice to be here. I'm glad I got the invitation. One of the things that's probably going to happen for a while, just so everybody knows, is down here at the bottom left, because I'm currently a co-host, I'm going to keep getting these little pop-ups as people enter the meeting area. So we're just going to have to deal with that for a little while. I apologize for it, but it's just one of those fun Zoom things that are going to happen to us. If you wish to ask a question during the presentation, I want you to notice that there is a chat box that you can actually start, and you can start it by coming over here and saying, I want to chat, and you'll see a little box that'll appear something like that, and you can type in there and put a question out there. And I'll try and pay attention to that and see if I can actually manage to answer questions as they come in. So what I want to do is I want to at least introduce some people to who I am. The stamp shows, in particular in Chicago or various other places, you'll probably see this guy with a red hat. I tend to wear the red hat so people can recognize me and see who I am and maybe say hello. Professionally, what I do is I'm actually a vegetable and poultry farmer. And of course, whenever somebody comes to do a story about our vegetable and poultry farm, you'll notice they always come when it's winter. So all the things inside your building are dead and everything's brown. So it doesn't look like I'm much of a farmer when you get those kinds of pictures. And the other thing that you might want to know about me is I have a PhD, and I have a PhD in computer science and adult education. And so it makes perfect sense then that I collect postal history and that I farm. I mean, what else would a person like me do with a PhD in those two things? So at least now you have some idea of who you're looking at and what I do. I know that my face is maybe a little dark right now. We're going to see if we can get some light in front of me instead of behind me so you can see what I look like. We'll work on that as we go. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to just move on to the presentation and get to the fun stuff. Folks in postal history and stamp collecting know me for collecting the 24-cent 1861 stamp. And in particular, I like them on postal history, on envelopes or wrappers. And I actually exhibit this material and enjoy it very much. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of a tour of some of the things I see when I'm looking at a piece of postal history with a 24-center on it, and see if you can come to a point where you might enjoy what I enjoy at the same time. So the big deal about the 24-center stamp is that it was created specifically to cover the 24-cent rate to England via the US and British Convention of 1848. And it's a little more complicated than that, but I just wanted to show you a couple standard covers. You'll notice that this one right here is an 1860 issue. So this is the prior design, and the one down here is the 1861 issue. So this is the design down here that I tend to collect. But both of them pay the same 24-cent rate. And you'll notice down here at the bottom left, whenever this little pop-up doesn't show up, that the first half ounce costs 24 cents. The next half ounce costs another 24 cents. But then when you jump between 1 and 2 ounces, you actually have to pay 48 cents more. There was no increment after you got past an ounce at the half ounce rate. You had to go by ounces. And that kind of caused a little bit of confusion, and we'll talk about that one in a little bit. This is one of the fun things that I get into because I enjoy all of the little nitty gritty stuff that maybe some people look at me cross-eyed for, you know, so why are you enjoying this so much? And I'm going to try and show you why I think it's kind of fun. A really simple thing that you can start looking at for mail that went to England is you can say, okay, what kind of ship did it go on? And what I mean by that is there were shipping lines that had an American contract or a US contract to carry the mails. And then there were other contracts with the British government to carry the mail between the two places. And at that time, the 24 cents didn't just go to the United States. They actually had to have an accounting. Who got how much of that 24 cents? So if it went via an American packet or an American ship, then they had to give 3 cents to the British. And the rest of the money stayed with the Americans because the Americans were paying for the ship and they were paying for their surface mail. And then you'll notice right here, and this, I chose this particular cover because this is a Chicago 3 cents marking right here. We've got the 3 and the cents in an arc. And that is basically put on there by the exchange office in Chicago saying, hey, we recognize this is going to go on an American packet and we need to make sure 3 cents of this 24-cent stamp is going to go to the British Postal Service. If it went via British packet, then if you look down here, there's a red Boston marking and it says 19 paid down here at the bottom. So what that's saying is we need to give the British 19 cents because it was a British packet. The British were responsible for paying the shipping company, so they got 3 cents for their surface mail when it arrived there and 16 cents for the ship, and the US got to keep 5 cents. So it's kind of nice if you ever want to look at purchasing a 24-cent or a cover like this, you're going to be looking at the 3 and the 19 or multiples of that, and that'll give you some ideas of how it got to where it was going. And it doesn't take too long to start figuring this out once you start seeing the pattern. So here's 2 examples where we get to the second rate level. It's over a ½ ounce, it's up to 1 ounce. And so it requires 48 cents, and there's 48 cents down here. But now because it's a double rate, there's a red 6 here. That's how much money we're passing to the British. You'll notice a 6 cents down here in an arc, which is the Chicago marking. So both of these must have gone via an American packet because it's a multiple of 3 cents as opposed to a multiple of 19 cents. So that's your clue right there. If you're looking for those multiples, you know which one they went through. Now we're going to have more fun. Here's the third rate level. If it's over 1 ounce and up to 2 ounces, it's going to cost us 96 cents to send this thing. You can't pay, if it was 1 ounce and a quarter, you still have to pay 96 cents. If it's 1 ounce and 3/4, it's still 96 cents. It's just the way it is. This cover is a lot of fun for me because if you'll notice, there's a too late marking right here. And what happened is the person who mailed this or the company who mailed this put this little marking on the back down here. This is the company marking, and it says November 30 on it. Now, if you look over here, somebody wrote a docket that says November 29, 1867. So clearly, these folks were really interested in making sure everybody knew when they mailed this thing. And here's why they were worried about it. The Golden City left San Francisco on November 29. This would be a mail ship that would go down to Panama and then it would meet another ship that would go up to New York. So they wanted to try and show whoever they were mailing this to that they were diligent in getting it to the mail. And the Postal Service said, wait a minute, you got this little marking down here where clearly you had it in your possession on November 30. The ship left on November 29. You were a little too late to get to that ship. So if you look above here, the San Francisco postmark says December 10. And that's when the Sacramento left San Francisco to go down to Panama. So the Postal Service was really interested in trying to make everybody understand, nope, you didn't get it to us on time. It's not our fault that it's later than you wanted people to think. What's really interesting about this cover is it started in December of 1867, By the time it got to New York, it was January 1st, 1868. The postal rate actually dropped from 24 cents to 12 cents as of the 1st of 1868. So it gets even more interesting that it crosses over postal rate periods. And the thing that's even more fun is if you notice there's a steamer marking over here. At the point we reach 1867, all mail from San Francisco was going to go overland unless they specifically said, I want it to go by steamer. So everybody now should ask the question, and I don't know the answer to this, why in the world, if they would send it via overland and get there faster than the steamer, would they want to put it on a steamship, get it there too late, get a too late marking, and have it leave on December 10? If anybody can ever figure out that answer, send me a note, because I would like to know it myself. I'm really not sure. But this is one of the covers I enjoy very much. We're going to make this even more fun. What happens if you didn't pay enough? All right, so here are two examples of when they didn't pay enough. This one right here has a 24-cent stamp. So does this one right here. And if this thing moved out of the way, I think you could see, let's see if I can get it to go. There's a marking right here that says 2/ that would be 2 shillings. 1 shilling is the equivalent to 24 cents. So when this thing got to its recipient in London, they had to pay 2 shillings for the privilege of getting this piece of mail. And that would be the same for this one right here. So here's what happened. These things both weighed more than a half an ounce. They probably weighed less than an ounce. That means it would cost 48 cents to mail it. So they were marked as short paid. And since they were short paid, that meant they weren't paid enough. And in today's world, you would think, well, they were short paid 24 cents, correct? Wouldn't you think they'd just collect 1 shilling or 24 cents at the destination? Unfortunately, the agreement between the two nations was, if you didn't pay enough, it's the same as not paying anything at all. So these folks were required to pay 2 shillings, even though somebody had paid the equivalent of 1 shilling to get it there. Doesn't seem fair, but that's what they were doing. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So you remember I mentioned the idea that we had up to a half ounce was 24, up to an ounce was 48, and then you jumped all the way to 96 cents between 1 and 2 ounces. Well, that wasn't necessarily what a lot of people thought should happen in the United States, because when you paid for your mail service in the United States, it was 3 cents for every half ounce. And so, of course, they figured, well, it should be 24 cents for every half ounce. So this person put 3 24-cent stamps on there, paying 72 cents, and figured, hey, it weighed less than an ounce and a half, so it must be good. The treaty said, no, that's not true. You had to pay 24 cents more. So this thing right here, this big marking, is a 4. And so they need 4 shillings, or 4 times the base rate, in order to pay this darn thing off. So that's a lot of money for the privilege of getting something that you may not even know what in the world it is. So the question is how could they get away with this? And the answer has to do with the fact that we're transferring between a period where we didn't have to pay by stamps. We're starting to move into the period where prepayment is important. And what has happened prior to this is people were used to sending things without prepaying. And then what would happen is the Postal Service would deliver, and the person who was the recipient would possibly refuse the mail, which means that the Postal Service has collected the mail, taken it overseas, delivered it, had it refused, and they've provided all the services and got no money. So they are working very hard at this point to try and encourage people to prepay everything they're supposed to pay and get that covered. And so if you kind of consider, well, how much money were they losing for people who were refusing mail? Maybe they could be forgiven for being a little bit harder with unpaid or partially paid mail. The good news for everybody who was a Postal Service patron at the time is this practice was going to start changing as we got later in the 1860s. If you thought the last one was bad, how about this one? There's 5 24-cent stamps on there. They figured they paid enough, but there's our short paid marking and there's our 6 shilling marking. And that tells us that no, in fact, you didn't pay the 6 stamps you needed to pay. So that money right there, paid for no services. The US Postal Service gets to pocket all that. The British Postal Service gets to pocket 6 shillings so the person can get that and read whatever's in this envelope. And this right here is probably one of the highlights of my collection. I have enjoyed having this for some time now. And it's just, if you like the 24-cent design, you can really get a good look at it here, despite the pen cancels, because it's still fairly clear what's going on. So finally, in 1866, in the middle of the year, they decided, okay, let's change the agreement with the British. Remember, this has been going on since the late 1840s that they have had these no odd rates. So in April of 1866, they said, we're going to go ahead and allow the half rate increments. So now it is a rate of 24 cents for every half ounce. So here's somebody who paid something that's a triple rate. It came through okay. We've got a paid marking here. We've got a 57 cents that goes to the British, and this 3 down here tells us it's a triple rate. The 57 is how much goes to the British. This is that it's a triple rate. And we've got paid markings both from Boston and in London, just showing that this thing did, in fact, get paid. This is a fairly uncommon cover to find. There was really only about 1.5 years that this was actually something that could be done with the 24 cent before the rate dropped to 12. So this is a very interesting cover, especially if you put it with the other triple rate cover that wasn't accepted. You can learn a lot about how different they are when you see that. I noticed that there is a person asking about the 20 short paid on the triple rate cover that we showed a while ago. So there was a black 20 on that triple rate cover. I'm going to see if I can actually get this thing to go back, if it'll let me. There we go. So this 20 up here is what's being asked about, and there's a short paid. All right, so once again, this person thought 3 stamps would be enough, but they were going to need 4. They were going to need 4 times 24 cents to pay it. So the short paid marking says, hey, we recognize in New York, we recognize that this is not short paid. And if it's short paid, that means that the British need to collect 4 shillings. Of those 4 shillings, 20 cents have to come back to the United States, because the United States is providing 20 cents worth of service. 4 times 5 cents, 5 cents for the surface mail in the United States, and the British are covering all of the mail packets overseas and all of their own postage. So that's what the 20 is for, is that's reminding the British to send some money back. All right, I'm going to go back forward again. Let's go to the next thing. So that's just an overview of the British Convention. Here's where it gets crazy. This is why I have so much fun with this particular stamp, is at the time the stamp was used, we actually had multiple agreements with different countries to get mail between each other. The British Convention helped us get mail between us and the British and their territories and to maybe other countries. But if you wanted to get things to the French, then there was a French Postal Convention started in 1857. And in this case, it was 15 cents per quarter ounce of letter mail. The French were known to be obstinate about a number of things, and among them was the fact that they wanted to use grams and not ounces. So they wanted a 7.5 gram rate per, which is about 1/4 ounce. But something to keep in mind is a 1/4 ounce and 7.5 grams don't convert perfectly. So sometimes we get weird things that happen with French mail back and forth between the two countries. So here's an example in front of us. I've got 30 cents of postage right here. So that's a double rate. So it'd be something between a 1/4 ounce and a 1/2 ounce. And you'll notice the red 6 here. That red 6 is telling us how much money the United States is passing on to the French. All right, so in this case, it must have gone by American ship, which means we're covering the postage for the transatlantic trip. We're covering our own postage, and then 6 cents go to cover the French for their own postage. So that's what's going on here. One of the neat things about this cover is this stamp, and I know it's very hard to see with just the picture. There's a little line on Washington's forehead right there, and the blow up is down here. For those of you who have a Scott catalog and you've seen the little notation for scratch under A variety, that's what it looks like. For the longest time, I didn't necessarily know what that was because I didn't get to see one. Let's go back to that. There we go. So that's what the scratch under A looks like, and this is what's on that particular stamp. The crazy thing about the scratch under A, anybody who collects classic stamps will know that the 24-cent stamp often gets cancellations on it that are pretty heavy. So you could have a scratch under A copy and not be able to see it at all because it's pretty easy to cover that up. All right, so here we are with the French. We're asking where the postage went here. So here is another 30 cents. It's a double rate, and it's a US ship. And the French get 12 cents here because they're going to need money to go through their own country and through the British, because this particular ship went from the United States to Britain, then it crossed the Channel to France. So Britain wants a little bit of money out of France here. And instead of the United States paying the British, the United States put 12 cents into the hands of the French, and then the French put whatever their agreement was with the British for anything that would cross the Channel. So this is kind of one of those weird telephone things where you tell somebody something and then it goes to somebody else. So the question, I noticed there's a question here about how this money gets passed back and forth. And in fact, yes, what would happen is packets of mail would be put into mail bags, and on top of each bundle, there would be a mail bill that would include a summary of what's coming across. And these mail bills would allow them to maintain tracking for who got how much money from whom. It's a very complex system. It's very interesting, and it's very confusing if you're a postal historian, because once you start going through multiple countries like this one does, and they all have different kinds of monetary systems, it can be hard to track and make sure everything's equivalent. But if you love puzzles, this is great stuff. This is stuff that I very much enjoy. Down here at bottom left, and I realize this little screen keeps popping up here, at bottom left there's a chart that kind of gives you an idea that there are multiple ways we could get things, and there are different credit amount increments depending on which shipping line carried this thing. At the bottom right is a cover that wasn't paid enough. So this one has 24 cents here. It needed 30 cents, and the French identified that with this. This is actually a 2 right here, and that 2 means that it's overweight. It's a double rate. And so they said, we need 160 centimes, or 16 decimes. I can't say it very well today. We need this much money, which is the equivalent to 48 cents once again. So short paid, you got to pay it all to the French, and the French have to send back 6 cents to the United States. So it's all right here in front of us, how all the accounting goes. And then they have to then have summary sheets to try and track it all. And at the end of the year or quarterly, depending on what year we're talking about, they would settle up accounts. What's interesting about it is a lot of these postal agreements were beginning to change because they were starting to realize when they got to the end of the year, they weren't sending a whole lot of money back and forth. They were all balancing out the mail volume. So it was kind of getting to the point where they were like, well, you know what, you keep the postage you collect, we'll keep the postage we collect, and it'll all come out in the wash. That's how it started to go as we go into the 1870s, and then the Universal Postal Union in 75. But at this point in time, they're still passing money all over the place. So here are some pretty French covers. This is a triple rate up here. This one has 45 cents in postage on here. And you might notice, let's get this moved. You might notice that this is the amounts depending on the route. So if you're going via Havre, Brest, Britain, whatever, these are the amounts I would expect on this cover. And there's a 36 right here. Don't look at the 45, look at the 36. The 36 is the credit I'm passing on to France. So it's one of these that's going on here. My next clue is this French marking. The words are serve, S-E-R-V, American, A-M, Calais. So what this is saying is it took an American service or an American packet or ship, and it entered France, and it entered it at Calais. So now I know it's an American service. That means that it went via Britain if it came through Calais. Otherwise, I would have had one of these cities on here. So that means the 36 makes some sense to me right here. The 45 is merely a marking that was placed on there at the point that it was mailed to show how much postage was to be put in total on this. It wasn't always the case that the postage was on it when the person mailed it. They may have given 45 cents. They may have struck a 45 on there so that then they knew how many stamps to put on, and away it went. So this is more a marking of saying how much money do we need to pay. Down here at the bottom, this one right here has enough postage for a 6 times rate. Plenty of postage for it. It's got a beautiful illustrated cover. Probably could do another story someday on the person it's mailed to. But the thing I see right here is this 30. I think it would be too generous to say that that's a 36. I think that's a 30 right there. And that would be an illustration that it came via Britain and that it was a 5 times rate with a 30-cent credit, because any 6 times rate is going to have one of these numbers right here. So if you think that's a 36, it's a 6 times rate, but I think it's a 30, so it's probably a 5 times rate. And this is one of those cases where maybe the conversion between grams and ounces, perhaps the people in New York thought, hey, we need 6 times. So they put the postage on there and they struck them with the cancellations, and away it went. But it's kind of hard to tell. They probably changed their mind at some point in time and didn't bother changing the number. This is something we'll never know. We can only speculate. But it's still pretty, and it still shows a multiple rate. So away we go with it. So those are 2 postal conventions. I don't want people to get completely bogged down, so I'm just going to mention there were others. There was a Belgian convention at 27 cents per half ounce. So here's one to Belgium right here. And a Prussian closed mail convention at 28 cents per half ounce. This is an example right here that's a double rate cover. There's 56 cents in postage right there. And this went to the German state of Baden. This is kind of interesting in that Baden, not all the German states agreed to this Prussian rate immediately. Baden actually waited till 1863. Prior to that, they would have had a higher rate of 30 cents. So sometimes things change. There were other agreements, Hamburg, Bremen. The Netherlands had a late agreement in 1867. But this just gives you an idea of what we had to deal with. Could you imagine being a postmaster at this time and trying to keep track of all these rates with different postage rates and different rules? If you love puzzles, you would have loved being a postmaster at this time. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about some different things. Those of you who like postage rates probably had a fun time. But let's do something that maybe expands the interest a little bit and we don't stick with all those postage numbers. All these pieces of mail I've shown so far had to cross the Atlantic. And during the period of use, the 1861 stamp, I tend to think of it as running from 1861 to about 1869 that people would use this stamp. But I tend to really work on 1861 to 67 when I'm doing research. So down here is an example of some of the mail packets, some of the companies that actually had contracts to take mail across the Atlantic. And I just grabbed a few years, representative years, 1863, 4, 6, and 7, to show you how much of the mail each of these covered. So the Cunard line carried much more than everybody else, but you'll notice it declines over time. The Cunard line had a contract with the British, and the only other line that was carrying mail at this time that had a contract with the British was the Galway line. And you'll notice they didn't, let's go back. They did not carry too terribly much of the mail, and they only carried that mail in 1864. So it's quite a thing if you can come up with something that was carried on the Galway line. And in fact, this cover right here it went on the Galway mail packet Hibernia. And the good news here is I did not have to do what Dick Winter had to do. Dick Winter had to go through and check all the newspapers and try and put his tables together for his outstanding book on the transatlantic mail, so you could go look up these things on shipping tables. So thank goodness for him. I had an easier time finding some of this information out. And then I can go verify with the newspapers myself if I want to. But this is an uncommon cover going by the Galway line. You'll notice it's got a 19 paid right here with the Boston marking, which tells us it went via a British contract ship. So all of that's consistent, and we have an interesting cover. And here's a cover that's been a favorite of mine for years now. And it's been a favorite because I noticed something about it. Somebody else shared it with me, and I noticed something about it and said, do you realize what you have? And they were willing then to sell it to me at the price that they bought it for, because I noticed it and they didn't. It was a very kind thing for them to do. But if you look carefully, trying to get my mouse to go there, it was mailed in Galesburg, Illinois on June 10. It was received at Glasgow on July 10 of 1867. So what I happen to know, because I do this all the time, is I happen to know a full month's travel for this kind of mail is too long. And so I said, if it's too long, I should start researching why that might be. So this map up here actually shows you the travel that this piece of mail took. It started in Galesburg and went to Chicago. It got this 3-cent marking down here. And then it went by rail up to Quebec. Technically, it's Rivière du Loup, but Quebec is close enough. It got on a ship, and it was going through the St. Lawrence Seaway and got to the Anticosti Island and ran aground. So now it's stuck. They can't go anywhere. They took the passengers off and put them on the island, and a couple of the residents there hosted them. And then a ship came from St. John's and picked up the passengers and the mail, came back to Quebec, and the mail was then left in Quebec for the next ship, which would leave on June 29 and go back out through the Seaway, and it would find its way then to England. So it's kind of a long way to get there, but it has a great story, so I enjoy having this one a lot. Here's another interesting story. We've got this adhesive over here on the left-hand side, and it looks like this right here. This is called a Westtown local. There was a law at this time that said if it's a post road, nobody else could carry the mail. But it just so happened there was no post road between Westtown School and the closest post office. So some enterprising people said, hey, for 2 cents, we'll carry the mail to the post office for you. And they actually went ahead and made little adhesives and sold them for 2 cents, and they could put them on the envelope, and it would get carried to the street road station. And the street road station would be in here, right in this area next to Westchester. It's a station on the railway that goes to Philadelphia. And that is a fairly common thing to see with the 3-cent stamp for domestic mail. It just so happens I was able to find one that has the Westtown local that goes overseas to London. And the addressee is a former student of the West Town School. All right, here's another interesting one that's very different. It doesn't look like much if you're somebody who just says, yeah, Rob, I've seen a bunch of 24-cent stamps on a cover to England. Looks like the others, maybe even a little messier looking. It's a little ratty. But this squiggle right here got my attention. It actually is this marking over here. It's a steamboat marking. And that marking would have been applied on the Great Lakes. And a steamboat marking means that somebody gave it to a steamer captain on the Great Lakes and said, could you get this mailed for me? And the captain was supposed to be reimbursed 2 cents for each item when they got to the post office. So that's what the steamboat marking is supposed to do, is it's kind of an indication, hey, we got it on the steamboat, we paid the captain 2 cents. The problem is that there was no way to collect 2 cents from the recipient, because the recipient in this case was in England. If they were in New York or Illinois or Pennsylvania, then they could easily have collected the 2 cents and it would have gotten the Postal Service reimbursed. But this is a case where probably the captain still got his 2 cents, because he probably would have gotten a little upset if they said no. But the Postal Service ended up floating him the 2 cents because there was no way for them to get it back. This is where it gets a little more fun. We've got something from the Cariboo Gold Rush in British Columbia. And it's got a 24-center that's been pasted over a strip of 3 2.5-penny rose stamps from British Columbia. This one's a little bit more difficult to explain, and I'm just going to give you some highlights. But it just so happens that there was enough mail coming through from the Gold Rush and from Vancouver Island here that the post office in Victoria carried U.S. stamps, because there was no way at the time to stay out of the United States and get to England. So they had to go through San Francisco and then either go overland or down to Panama to get to the East Coast. So here we are, we're up here at Williams Creek, and we come down by the Cariboo Road, and then we get on the Fraser River and to New Westminster. One of the interesting things about this is these 2.5-penny stamps were provisionally used as a 3-penny stamp at this time, because the rates had changed and they weren't able to print new stamps in time. So they used these with the understanding that they actually stood for 3 pennies instead of 2.5. For those who might be interested in learning more about this, Steve Walsky has put together some great articles on this. So if you want to read more and learn more about it, that's where you want to go for the information. I have an example here of disinfected mail. By the time we get to the 1860s, people were becoming pretty aware that you couldn't kill whatever was being spread, in this case cholera, by disinfecting the mail. But sometimes public responses demanded some sort of physical response to show that you were trying to do something to protect them. So this is a case where in England, they cut the envelopes. You'll notice there's a cut right here and a cut right here. And I put a piece of paper through there when I scanned this, so it would highlight that this cuts all the way through the envelope. And the letter that is inside of this envelope also displays these cuts. And so they would cut this, and then they would use whatever they were using for fumigation to try and kill the disease so it wouldn't cause a problem. And then they would end up delivering it at that point. There are not too terribly many things in the 1860s that exhibit it, but if you do find them, it most likely will be in Italy as opposed to England that you're going to see disinfection slits of this sort. This one just happens to be in England. I don't know a whole lot more than that, and I would like to learn more. So if somebody wants to feed me more information, I'd be happy to learn it. All right. We're doing pretty well for time. I just want to check how that's going. So here's some redirected mail. So these are 2 pieces that made it to England, made it to London, in fact. And This piece of mail right here got to its original destination. Notice this right here, I know it's hard to read, says it's care of Benjamin Rush, Esquire. So they mailed it to Mary Rush, care of this individual, and then there's an address right here, and that's in Portman Square. And they've crossed it out, and there's a new one up here for Cavendish Square. So this thing got to the initial destination. They realized it needed to go somewhere else, so it got forwarded. This is an example, though, because you see this R in a ring right here. This is indicating that this is a free redirection of mail because we stayed within the same postal district in England. It didn't have to go to another post office, so they didn't have to pay more money. So there were various markings that looked kind of like this ring with an R in it, and that was an indication that we redirected it for free because we stayed in the same postal district. But if you left the postal district in England, or if you had to move it to another country, you had to pay for it. So down here, we've got an item, and this item went to an address in London, and the person was no longer there. So they have a new address in Paris right here. And the rate to go from London to Paris, from England to France, was 4 pennies. 1, 2, 3, 4. So we've got 4 pence right there. It paid the rate. And this little oval paid PD down here tells us that they had paid the money that they needed to pay for it to get from England to France. So there's the 24 center to get from the US to England, 4 pence to get from England to France. So we have some things that go to further destinations. China was a place that we didn't have a direct agreement with at the time. And so we used our agreement with the British in order to mail things to China. And we have 2 examples here. This one shows a 45-cent rate. This one shows a 53-cent rate. And we have 2 different routes on this map. The 53-cent rate would go to England, Southampton, and it would go through France and come down here to Malta and then go to the Suez and on to where it needed to go. The 45-cent rate took this blue route. It would take the sea route going around Portugal and Spain, stopping at Gibraltar and on to Malta, and then the route was exactly the same to get to where it needed to go. For the privilege of paying 45 cents instead of 53 cents, you got the slow boat to China. This is the slow boat to China, folks, if you're wondering what that meant. You paid for a slower route to go this way, but you still got to the ultimate destination. The tricky thing about this is if you look carefully, and I know you can't see it because of this weird stuff down here, if people knew ship sailing dates well enough, they could actually pay the 45 cents, get it to here, and get it to Malta at the same time that they could have done this if they knew all the sailing tables for things that would leave. So there were some fairly tricky people that knew how to read sailing tables and would pay 45 cents and actually get the mail there at the same time as somebody else who paid 53 cents. It's kind of fun, but can you imagine, folks, now having more than one rate that you could pay to get to the same destination? That could get pretty crazy, I think. So here's something to Italy, and I wanted to bring this up because I wanted to point out that not every country in Europe had an agreement with the United States. So that meant we had to rely on an agreement with somebody else that had an agreement with that country. And it just so happens Italy had an agreement with France. We had an agreement with France. So you could send mail via France to get to Italy. And this is an example of a 21-cent rate times 3 via France to get to Italy. And typically the mail would start up here and go through Paris. And then it had a couple of options. One was to take the mountain route and stay on the ground and come down here. The other was to go down to the port and take a ship. And you could take a ship either directly to Rome, essentially, or you could take the coastal steamer that would make several stops. So you either had the fast route via train and carriage, or you could have a slower route that would take a ship. Two options. So here we have a couple of options. This is a 27-cent rate times 2 to Rome, and this is a 27-cent rate times 1 to Rome. And it just so happens this one right here took the land route, and this one took a sea route. And we know that because on the back of this cover is a Rome marking that says Via de Mar, which means by the sea. You'll notice they cost the same as far as price to the United States was concerned, 27 cents times 1 or 27 cents times 2. You might also notice that this was a 21-cent rate, and this is a 27-cent rate. This is where our history comes in. It turns out that Rome and the Papal State of Rome was still separate from the rest of Italy. So the mail that had to get to Rome essentially went through more than one postal service. It would go to England, it would go to France, and then it would go to the Kingdom of Italy before it made it to the Papal State. So that's why it actually costs 6 cents more to move it. All right, I noticed there's a question about the significance of orientations of the stamps on the covers. Because you notice we sometimes have stamps on the top and the bottom, on the right. We've had a few that are upside down. So Dave, I recognize the question, and my answer to you is I have no proof that it does or does not. There are some people, I think, who speculate about that, but from what I have seen thus far, it's often just a matter of where they put all their markings. I mean, we've got the address here. We have markings that tell them what route they want to take here, and that kind of left here and here for a stamp. So part of me feels like that's probably as much of a reason for the orientation of the stamps in most of these cases as anything. Other folks can feel free to disagree with me, and that would be perfectly fine. Here's something from Switzerland. Actually, 3 somethings from Switzerland. So remember I mentioned we have more than one rate to China? Well, here's 3 different rates to Switzerland. We had no agreement with Switzerland at the time, which meant we could use an agreement with Hamburg, we could use an agreement with the French, we could use an agreement with the Prussians. Any of those could possibly work, but they all cost different amounts. So Hamburg was 19 cents per half ounce, France was 21 for a quarter ounce, and Prussian closed mail was actually 33 cents to go all the way to the destination for a half ounce. So why in the world would you ever use the one on the bottom? 33 cents for a half ounce is a whole heck of a lot more than 19, until you realize that you had to wait 4 weeks for the ship that would go to Hamburg that would allow you to have the 19-cent rate. If you were in a hurry to get mail to somebody, you were willing to pay more, either via French mail or Prussian closed mail, to get it there. And if you were mailing something that was really light, less than a quarter ounce, then French mail was a pretty good choice. But if it was heavier, then suddenly the Prussian mail was actually better than the French mail, because it's going to be 42 cents for up to a half an ounce, 33 cents down here. So people had choices to make. So we all sometimes have trouble remembering how much postage is it going to take to mail something to each other. I don't always remember because it's changed enough. Well, now we have people who are paying attention to sailing tables, multiple rates to one country, multiple routes to one country, and making decisions on what's the best way. I cannot quite imagine having to do that myself. The bottom cover is kind of fun because this one's only paid 28 cents. So this is a case where they paid 28 cents to get it to the border of Switzerland and Germany, or Prussian territory at that time. So the 28 cents got it to the border, and the Swiss collected 10 centimes to pay for their domestic mail. And this boxed marking right here is essentially saying this is paid to the Prussian mail border. In other words, it got to the Swiss border. That's how much it's paid for. So the Swiss knew they had to collect a little bit more to get it to the destination. This is kind of a fun cover, and sometimes covers like this, if you don't know what you're looking for, you won't recognize it. It's different than some of the other covers. But what tipped me off was a combination of this red 10 and this blue box. And now you have something that tells you to start looking and learning more. So here's a map of Switzerland. I wanted to just do this very quick because some people love maps, and I happen to love maps. So we've got France over here. We've got Germany. So this would be Baden over here and Württemberg. The entries into Switzerland that the United States would typically use, there's 5 of them. Actually, well, yeah, 5. I'll say 5. We've got Geneva down here, Pontarlier, Basel, Schaffhausen, and Constance. So if it was coming via French mail, it would come through Paris typically, and it would either go here, here, or here. Any of those 3. And it would be tempting to say it would depend on whether it was going to one region or the other. But the reality is the French rail lines had very complex scheduling. So whatever schedule was the best is the route it took. So if for some reason the best rail schedule took it down here to Geneva, but it was supposed to go somewhere to the interior, it would use French rail, go to Geneva, and pop back up via Swiss mail to get to where it wanted to go. So we can't always tell which of these 3 entry points it went if it came through French mail. On the other hand, if it went through Germany, if it went through Hamburg or Prussian closed mail, then we have the most typical option is it would come through Basel via rail. A secondary option would be Schaffhausen. It would come through rail through here. And the least likely is it would come down here to the lake and enter Switzerland via Constance. Friedrichshafen is on this side, and it would take a lake steamer here. That's the most unlikely route. It's going to be one of these other 2. But that kind of gives you an idea of how things got to where they were going. Okay, so we've got just a couple more. I think we're reaching the end of our time here. This one right here is a piece of mail to St. Petersburg, Russia. And there's a fair amount I could say about this thing, but I think we're just going to look at it and say, isn't that pretty? And leave it at that for now. But this gives you a rough idea of the route that this thing took to get up here. And we have some various markings in here. These would be Prussian markings that are giving us an idea of how much money gets passed on to Russia. This mark right here is essentially, it's a WF or a Viter Franco. It's basically saying that we have a payment that we're passing on to the next country. And just to show some different locations for those who might be interested, here's Peru. Peru is an interesting destination at this time because early in the 1860s, the rate was 34 cents. We get to the middle of the 1860s and it was dropped to 22 cents. This is a twice 22-cent rate right here. And then later in the 1860s, in 1868, it was raised back up to 34 cents. This is odd because during this period in time, most rates were actually going down. And this is one that was at one level, it was dropped, and then it was raised back up. And these were all by the half ounce. And you'll notice they tended to go through Panama. Well, that's not too terribly much of a surprise. And it didn't matter whether they went through San Francisco or the East Coast. They had to go through Panama to get there. Something that I haven't figured out for sure is whether this Panama marking seems to line up with a West Coast orientation and this one with the East Coast. I haven't spent enough time on that, but if somebody knows that, I'd love to hear something. All right, this is how I will close the presentation. We have traveled all over the place, and this is a cover that actually went to England and came back to the United States. So it got mailed 24 cents from Massachusetts. There's a marking here that says Boston, 19 paid. And underneath, or over that, I should say, is a London paid marking showing it got to London. And it's care of the Baring Brothers. Okay, they were a financial institution. And the Baring Brothers had an account for Mr. Bacon and he apparently had gone back home and closed his account. So what they did is they said, all right, let's forward it back to Massachusetts. And it went back to him, but because his account was closed, they didn't pay for it. So it got sent collect, essentially. So we've got this marking right here that's a marking that came about in Boston, saying we need to send 19 cents back to England, and we need to collect 24 cents from Mr. Bacon. The 24 cents is good if you have gold standard coinage, but if you have paper money, you needed to spend 32 cents. There's the 32 right there. You got it up here as well. So this is just one of those times where maybe it would have been better if he'd kept his account open just a little bit longer for any late mail. He might have paid a little bit less. If there are any questions, I could take a couple. I think we're pushing the edge of the hour.
I did have a question in there about how long it took to go across Panama back in those days.
Ah, okay, I missed that. So if we wanted to go via Panama, I wonder if I can show, let's do. So here's one that went from San Francisco on April 22, and it got to Panama on May 5. So that kind of answers your question right there. If you wanted to get to Panama from San Francisco, it takes that long. And you can probably suggest that it takes about the same amount of time to get from Panama to New York. Hopefully that answers your question.
I have a question, Rob.
Okay.
You said early on, you said, I wonder why they would send it by steamer when it would be faster to go overland. I'm wondering if a sizable amount of attacking of, I mean, we see the movies, people are always attacking coaches and there's always gun battles. Paper on it. Yep.
Reasons why they could have chosen steamer. Among them is weather. So we can't be sure. I have been unable to find anything that I could say is a plausible explanation other than maybe these individuals actually really didn't, they wanted to look like they were rushing it, but they really didn't want it to get there in a hurry. Sometimes I wonder if somebody was playing a game with this cover. I'm not entirely sure. And I'm not sure I'll ever be able to prove anything in particular, but it was fun.
Thanks.
I understand that the Chicago Philatelic Society is going to have a recording, but I am not entirely sure what their process for sharing it is.
I have a question that these postal rates are probably a lot of 1860 money. Who are the international correspondents? Are they mostly political? Are they high rollers? Who are these people?
Michael, that's a great question too. In general, and I hate to say this, I hate to be too definitive, but in general, this is business correspondence. So we're fairly lucky to get a lot of this because businesses held on to these full envelopes as records of business transactions. And so this was just a price of doing business for them. There, you can begin to see some personal correspondence, but like that really pretty French cover that we were talking about being 5 or 6 times rate, those were definitely, as you might call it, high rollers.
The Baroness?
Yeah, the Baroness, yes. I think that's a good indication that they had some money. So I think you're probably right in your assessment. I think we were beginning to see that people with less money were sending mail, domestic mail to each other with the Civil War. But I don't think you will find as many folks sending mail overseas. These prices were simply too high. But by 1875, we've got the General Postal Union, and prices begin really declining even in 1868. We go from 24 cents to 12 cents, and then it's down to 6 cents in a couple of years after that. So until that point in time, yes, I think people with plenty of money were the folks sending this mail. It's a good question.